Before we begin, consider subscribing. It helps us keep exploring parts of biblical history that often remain overlooked. Today, we investigate a mystery that scholars quietly discuss but rarely bring to the public. A psalm attributed to King David that later priests hesitated to recite. The Hebrew Bible we read today is stable and well preserved, but the liturgical traditions surrounding it were not always uniform. In the centuries between David and the Second Temple period, certain psalms gained reputations, some for healing, some for warfare, and a few for something far more unsettling. One of those rare texts was a psalm David wrote during one of the darkest moments of his life. The tradition surrounding it is simple but striking. A group of priests believed that reciting it aloud invited divine scrutiny, not punishment. Scrutiny. A searchlight into the soul that few wanted directed at them during worship. This belief didn't come from superstition. It arose from the psalm's content itself, a composition that spoke not only of human enemies, but of an adversary David described in language far heavier than metaphor. Historical records from early rabbinic discussions hint at this tension. Some sages argued it should be recited only privately. Others claimed it was safe only for individuals who had nothing hidden. The fact that such warnings existed at all tells us how seriously the text was taken. What we explore in this story is not a lost psalm. The Psalter is intact, but a lost meaning, a forgotten fear, and a controversy that shaped how ancient Israel worshipped. To understand it, we must return to David's early life, where danger was both physical and spiritual. David's rise from shepherd to king is often told as a triumphal arc, but the historical setting beneath it was fractured and tense. Israel was not a unified nation, but a loose confederation of tribes divided by loyalty, suspicion, and competition for resources. Bethlehem, David's hometown, sat near volatile borderlands where Philistine incursions were common. Archaeological studies confirm that families like David's lived with constant threat. Raiding parties moved through the Shephelah, and young shepherds often guarded their flocks alone for nights at a time. In this environment, fear was not abstract. It was a daily companion. These early experiences shaped David's understanding of danger long before he met Goliath or commanded armies. Rabbinic traditions describe David as a child who felt the tension of being overlooked within his own household. Whether these accounts are literal or symbolic, they highlight a consistent interpretation. David's formative years were marked by solitude and vulnerability. The Psalms reflecting this period, particularly those describing unseen threats in the night, align with the psychological landscape of someone raised in constant alertness. This background becomes essential when we analyze the psalm priests later feared. Its imagery of stalking forces, silent watchers, and adversaries moving in darkness doesn't begin in battlefields. It begins here, in the lonely hills of Judah, where a young shepherd listened to more than just the movement of animals in the grass. David's world was one where human danger and spiritual fear blended, and that mixture laid the foundation for a psalm unlike any other in his collection. The years that followed pushed David into a world far harsher than the quiet slopes of Bethlehem. When he entered Saul's service, Israel was already locked in a grinding conflict with the Philistines, a conflict marked by ambush warfare, sudden desert skirmishes, and the constant fear of betrayal. Archaeological excavations in the Judean foothills reveal charred settlements from this era, evidence of raids that came without warning. David's psalms often reflect the psychological weight of these events. He describes enemies who encircle, who lie in wait, who attack not only with weapons, but with accusations and false witnesses. Modern scholars note that this language aligns closely with accounts of ancient Near Eastern warfare, where night attacks and shifting loyalties were commonplace. But something else emerges in his writings. Moments where the threats are described in terms that do not fit any known human opponent. Phrases about forces moving in darkness, or an adversary who breathes ruin, strike a different tone, less military, more cosmic. While these lines are poetic, they reveal a worldview shaped by trauma and spiritual sensitivity. In David's experience, warfare was not purely physical. It was psychological, and at times, deeply spiritual. This background forms the foundation of the psalm that later generations handled with caution. It came from a time when David was hunted by Saul, betrayed by allies, and forced into foreign lands. The border regions where he hid were liminal spaces, lawless, empty, and ripe for fear. It was in these places that his language began to blend physical danger with imagery of a darker adversary. When priests in the Second Temple era encountered this psalm, they read it through their own experience of spiritual threat. To them, the intensity of David's words felt less like poetry and more like a confrontation with something that should not be spoken lightly. The trauma that shaped the psalm gave it a gravity they found unsettling, and perhaps too powerful for public worship. The stage is now set for the moment when this psalm became more than literature. It became a problem. By the time of the Second Temple, Israel's worship had become highly structured. Priests followed precise sequences of psalms for festivals, sacrifices, and daily services. Most of these texts were recited publicly without hesitation, but a small number carried reputations that made the priesthood uneasy. Ancient liturgical notes, along with later rabbinic discussions, hint at this divide. Certain psalms were labeled dangerous not because they contained forbidden ideas, but because they evoked themes associated with divine judgment, angelic conflict, or cosmic scrutiny. These themes were handled carefully, usually reserved for private prayer, not communal recital. Within this category fell the psalm attributed to David that concerns our story. The hesitation wasn't due to superstition. It came from a theological concern. The psalm described an encounter with an adversary in language that blurred the boundary between human enemy and spiritual force. Its imagery was too sharp, too explicit, too close to traditions about unseen beings that ancient Israel preferred to discuss indirectly. Priests believed that invoking these themes publicly risked drawing attention from powers best avoided. The fear was not that harm would come immediately, but that the psalm invited a kind of moral exposure, a confrontation with hidden faults. Some argued only the completely righteous should recite it aloud. Others insisted it was safe only when spoken privately at night, away from the congregation. This debate reveals something profound about the religious psychology of the time. The Second Temple priesthood operated in a world where spiritual forces were acknowledged but seldom named. Texts that named them too clearly made leaders uncomfortable. David's psalm with its vivid language and uncompromising tone, stood at the center of this unease. The question now is simple. What did the psalm actually say? To understand that, we turn to the moment that shaped it. The psalm at the heart of this controversy did not emerge from a ceremonial moment or a royal victory. It was born in a night of profound danger, a moment David later described with language so stark that later generations struggled to categorize it. Historical geography helps narrow the possibilities. During his years fleeing Saul, David spent long periods in regions such as the wilderness of Ziph, the caves around En-Gedi, and the ravines near Maon. These were landscapes where visibility faded quickly and ambushes were common. The Psalms linked to this period consistently mention darkness, isolation, and an adversary whose steps I could not hear. But the psalm that priests feared went further. Instead of describing soldiers or spies, David spoke of an enemy who moved without breath, whose presence pressed upon the soul, and who set traps for the spirit. These lines are not typical metaphors of war. They fit more comfortably within the language of ancient Near Eastern descriptions of spiritual beings, hostile entities that operated in the unseen, often associated with moral testing or judgment. Importantly, David never uses supernatural terminology directly. He does not name angels, demons, or mythical creatures. Instead, he describes the experience, the weight, the dread, the sense that the threat before him was not merely a man holding a blade. Early Jewish commentators wrestled with these lines. Some argued David described a moment of overwhelming psychological fear. Others believed he alluded to a spiritual adversary connected to divine judgment, not an independent being, but a force that confronted human wrongdoing. A few early Christian writers later interpreted the passage through the lens of spiritual warfare. Whatever its precise meaning, the psalm's tone is unmistakable. David is not pleading for safety. He is standing before something, naming it, and refusing to be overcome. This confrontational posture is what later priests found unsettling, not the fear, the boldness. The psalm does not ask God to hide him. It asks God to reveal the truth. And truth in the ancient world was something very few wanted to stand exposed before. What troubled priests most was not the adversary David described, but the line in which he declared what should happen to anyone found false under that gaze. That line became the center of theological debate. Among scholars who studied early liturgical customs, one detail stands out. Priests did not fear the entire psalm. They feared one sentence. The line appears in ancient commentaries with subtle variations, but the theme remains the same. David invokes God not simply as protector, but as examiner. And then he adds a declaration so uncompromising that later generations hesitated to speak it aloud. He asks God to expose falsehood wherever it lives, even if that falsehood is within the one praying. In its reconstructed form, the line reads something like, "Search the one who speaks. Let deceit return upon his own head." This is not a plea for mercy. It is a summons for judgment, immediate, precise, and inescapable. For the priests, this was the danger. Most psalms ask for deliverance, guidance, forgiveness. But this line asks for something far riskier, to be measured without leniency. It offers no shield of ritual, no buffer of sacrifice. It calls upon God to let the consequences of hidden wrongdoing fall directly on the petitioner. In the context of ancient Israel, where the purity of the priesthood was central to national identity, reciting such a line publicly was unsettling. It suggested that anyone reading it, priest or layperson, invited divine scrutiny upon themselves. Some rabbinic discussions record warnings like, "Let not an imperfect man speak this at the altar." Others suggest it should be whispered, or recited only by those certain of their way. Early Christian writers later commented that the line confronted the believer with absolute truth, leaving no room for self-deception. They saw it as an echo of the New Testament, warning that judgment begins with the house of God. But in the Second Temple era, the fear was more practical. No priest wanted to stand before the people and declare a line that asked God to judge him on the spot. This phrase, stark, bold, and morally dangerous, set the psalm apart. It explains the hesitation, the quiet recitation, and the long-standing discomfort surrounding David's words. The next chapter reveals how later traditions transformed this psalm's role from liturgy into something entirely different. When the early Christian writers encountered David's unsettling psalm, they viewed it through a very different lens than the Second Temple priesthood. Instead of fearing its confrontational tone, they connected it to broader themes in emerging Christian theology, especially the idea of unseen powers and spiritual testing. Writers like Origen, Tertullian, and later Augustine drew parallels between David's language and passages in the New Testament describing hostile spiritual forces, Paul's references to principalities and powers, and Peter's warnings about a spiritual adversary, created a framework that made David's imagery feel familiar rather than threatening. For these early interpreters, the line that priests feared became a declaration of purity and courage. David was not inviting destruction upon himself. He was demonstrating confidence that a righteous person need not fear divine examination. In this reading, the psalm became an expression of spiritual readiness, the posture of someone who lived transparently before God. Some writers went further, suggesting that David's confrontation with an unseen adversary prefigured the spiritual battles described in the New Testament. They saw in his words an early form of resistance, a refusal to submit to forces that sought to distort truth or weaken resolve. Interestingly, early Christians did not treat the psalm as dangerous. They treated it as clarifying. To them, the moral risk embedded in the forbidden line was not a threat, but a challenge, an invitation to live in such a way that divine scrutiny would reveal integrity. This shift in interpretation shows how theological context shapes the perception of a text. What one tradition fears, another might embrace. Yet the Christians still acknowledged the weight of David's words. They did not soften the imagery or reinterpret it as mere poetry. They accepted its severity and built upon it. By the 4th century, references to this psalm appear not in discussions of liturgy, but in writings about spiritual resilience, the endurance of the righteous under pressure, and the courage to stand before God without disguise. But while Christians approached the psalm with boldness, another tradition assigned it a very different role, one rooted not in worship, but in protection. By late antiquity, the psalm had shifted again, this time into a realm the priests of the Second Temple would have found deeply unsettling. fragments from Jewish magical texts, early Christian manuals, and writings from the Judean desert communities reveal that certain psalms, including David's more severe compositions, were recited not in worship, but in moments of spiritual danger. This psalm, with its stark confrontation and demand for divine scrutiny, became one of them. Its role was not theatrical. Ancient exorcistic practices focused on invoking God's authority to expose falsehood, precisely what the forbidden line demanded. The psalm's language about an adversary that moves in darkness or presses upon the soul resonated with traditions about hostile spiritual forces described in both Jewish and Christian writings. Evidence suggests that healers, hermits, and even some early monastic communities used passages from this psalm during confrontations with what they understood as spiritual oppression, not as a spell, not as a formula, but as a declaration of truth intended to challenge deceptive forces. The logic was simple. If a being thrived on concealment, a text that summoned judgment and exposure would destabilize it. But this practice had an unintended consequence. It cemented the psalm's reputation as a text associated with danger, not physical danger, but moral and spiritual intensity. People began to believe the psalm was only safe to recite if one's conscience was clear. Otherwise, it could turn on the speaker, echoing the forbidden line, "Let deceit return upon his own head." Even among communities that used it, the psalm was treated with caution. It was spoken quietly, deliberately, often at night, away from crowds. And as this tradition continued, its origins were gradually forgotten. Few remembered the moment in David's life that produced such language. Fewer still understood why the priests hesitated. What remained was a reputation that this psalm belonged to the shadows, to moments when truth and falsehood collided. But the real meaning of the psalm had little to do with rituals or fear. To uncover it, scholars turned back to history, to the world David actually lived in, and the pressures that shaped his imagination. What they found dissolved centuries of misunderstanding, centuries of fear, reinterpretation, and ritual use had obscured something simple. David did not write this psalm for priests, exorcists, or mystics. He wrote it as a man living in a world far more dangerous than most modern readers imagine. To understand the psalm's original force, scholars return to the historical landscape of David's life. The places mentioned in Samuel, the terrain described in the Psalms, and the conditions confirmed by archaeology. The picture that emerged was stark. David lived in a fractured region where tribal alliances shifted rapidly, borderlands were contested, and betrayal could come from within one's own camp. The wilderness of Judah, with its narrow canyons and sudden drop-offs, created ideal terrain for ambushes. The caves of En-Gedi, with their twisting tunnels, offered hiding, but also amplified fear. Even trusted companions could turn at the promise of reward from Saul. When scholars placed David's words back into this environment, the psalm transformed. The imagery of silent watchers and a presence in the darkness was no longer mystical exaggeration. It reflected the psychological strain of living under constant threat, the sense that danger could approach without sound, that one's enemy might not be visible until it was too late. The forbidden line, too, gained new clarity. David was surrounded by men who pledged loyalty while secretly weighing their options. He lived in a political reality where deception was a survival strategy. Asking God to expose falsehood, even if it existed in himself, was not reckless mysticism. It was a demand for moral stability in a world with none. The psalm was not written in fear. It was written in exhaustion. A cry from a man who had been hunted, betrayed, misrepresented, and forced to question the motives of everyone around him. In that context, his boldness makes sense. He needed truth, any truth, even if it cut him as well. When priests later recited the psalm, they lived in a very different world. Their fear reflected their era, not David's. They projected their anxieties onto a text that was never meant to be dangerous. And yet, in a way, their fear preserved the mystery. Their hesitation kept the psalm from becoming mundane. It remained charged, unsettling, powerful. All that remained was the task of uncovering the psalm's true purpose, the message David intended, and the reason he dared to speak words others would whisper for centuries. That final meaning emerges in the closing chapter, when the fragments of tradition, archaeology, commentary, and history are placed together. The psalm that once carried a reputation of danger reveals something far more grounded and far more human. David did not write it as a curse, nor as a mystical formula, nor to summon judgment upon others. He wrote it to anchor himself. At a time when his life was surrounded by hidden motives, political manipulation, and enemies who moved between shadow and daylight, David needed a declaration that cut through uncertainty. The psalm was that declaration, a confrontation not with demons or spirits, but with the very forces that threatened to distort truth in his life. The line later priests feared, "Search the one who speaks. Let deceit return upon his own head," was not crafted to terrify worshippers. It was a confession of integrity, a statement that he would rather be exposed than live falsely. A vow that his loyalty to God would not depend on secrecy, advantage, or self-preservation. In its original form, the psalm was an act of courage. Only centuries later did it gain a reputation as a dangerous text. Priests saw its moral intensity and recoiled. Early Christians saw its clarity and embraced it. Healers used it as a weapon against deception. And ordinary people whispered it with the belief that it held a kind of spiritual weight. But behind all these traditions stands a single moment. A man in the wilderness, surrounded by threats, choosing truth over survival. That choice shaped the psalm. The fear surrounding it came later, and that is the irony. The psalm that priests hesitated to recite aloud was not dangerous because of supernatural power, but because it refused to let the speaker hide. In a world built on ritual purity, political caution, and religious propriety, few were willing to stand before God with such openness. David was, and because he was, his words endured, unsettling, challenging, unforgettable. The psalm was never meant to frighten. It was meant to reveal. And it still does.